Okay, in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about eyewitness identification and this form of evidence that tends to be very compelling in court, but we often find that at least the research tells us, that there are a number of issues that can result in problematic eyewitness testimony. My hope is that by the end of this lecture, you have a better understanding of the 3 stages of memory, and how errors at each of these stages can result in problems recalling information. I hope that you can gain a greater understanding of how faulty eyewitness testimony is responsible for wrongful convictions. Understand some issues related to just some psychological processes that take place that make it difficult for us to have accurate eyewitness testimony. Understand that the relationship between confidence, an eyewitness's confidence, and the accuracy of the information they recall is often quite limited. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about some of the research-based recommendations that have been proposed to improve the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. One of the things you need to know is that typically eyewitness testimony is one of the more compelling forms of evidence that is presented in court. Think about in your own experience, if someone tells you that they saw something with their own eyes, or that they saw it happen, we tend to believe that person because that person is basing their opinion on their own kind of sensory process. This evidence in court, even if we, as we'll talk about later, even if we show some evidence to suggest that the accuracy of that testimony is not great, juries and judges still find this evidence really persuasive. And eyewitness testimony by itself tends to lead to more wrongful convictions than any other form of evidence. Some of the research that has been conducted suggests that eyewitness testimony by itself, at least here in America, is responsible for about 75% of the cases where people were wrongly convicted. Those persons may be found guilty, sent to prison, and then later exonerated based on the presence of some DNA evidence that implicates another individual. Some other research found that in 74% of faulty wrongful conviction cases, that eyewitness evidence was the only form of evidence that was presented to the court. And in about half of those cases, there was only a single eyewitness. So you're talking about cases where an individual may be sent to prison for decades based solely on the opinion of a single person who says they were at the scene where the crime took place. Sometimes that may be all there is, and it may be accurate, but what we know is that the evidence suggests that those single episode eyewitness testimony cases can result in faulty convictions. When we talk about eyewitness identification, we're obviously talking about the fact that an eyewitness has to rely on their own memory processes to be able to recall information to present in court. Memory tends to be sort of a 3-part process that involves the encoding or gathering of information that we can store in our brains, the actual ability to be able to hold that information in our brains, and then to pull that information out of our brains when we need to access it later, to use it for some other process. Okay. Errors can occur at each stage of that process, which can then ultimately result in imperfect testimony about the accuracy or imperfect recollection of what had actually occurred. Some of the psychological issues that often take place that can negatively impact our eyewitness identification processes are the presence of what we call the cross-race effect, which is a well-documented phenomenon in which an individual has a harder time recognizing individual differences in people outside their own race. So I, as a Caucasian person, might have difficulty seeing individual differences between people of color or from other races or ethnicities. This research is pretty robust and has actually been shown that children as young as about 9 months old have difficulty distinguishing individual differences between people outside of their own race. So in a case where, say, a Caucasian eyewitness were to be asked to identify an African American suspect, we might expect that the Caucasian eyewitness might have some difficulty correctly identifying the African American suspect. Another psychological factor that is often associated with faulty memory is the effect that stress has on our own memory processes. Many of you, including me, have heard people say that something was so stressful that the memory of that event was etched into their brain, or that there's no way they could ever forget it. But what some of the research shows is that actually stress has a negative impact on our ability to accurately encode information. And one example of that sort of negative stressful event that can impact our recollection is what we call the weapons focus effect. In that phenomenon, what happens is an individual who's confronted with, say, a knife or a gun may tend to focus more on the weapon that is being brandished at them rather than on the appearance of the suspect who is brandishing the weapon. And we think that actually is related to the stress and the fear associated with the possibility that you may lose your life. What has been demonstrated in the research is that oftentimes people are much more focused on that actual weapon than on the identity of the suspect who's confronting them. So that may lead to some difficulties in the ability to be able to identify that suspect later. As I mentioned earlier, eyewitness testimony tends to be one of the most compelling sources of evidence in court. And oftentimes, when an eyewitness is on the stand, they're asked, how confident are you that the individual that committed this crime is in the courtroom? And they may say, I'm 75% or I'm extremely confident. In those cases where they are highly confident, that is very compelling evidence to the judge or to the jury. But what the research shows us is that just because an eyewitness says that they are extremely confident in their opinion or in their identification, that actually is pretty weakly associated with the accuracy of their actual eyewitness testimony. And sometimes what we think may be related to that is initially we may be minimally sure of the individual that we identify as a potential suspect, but over time, especially if we're asked to identify that suspect or talk about that suspect again and again, either through additional lineup procedures or being interviewed by people, we come to develop it strengthens our confidence in our own recollection. So there may be some sort of cognitive dissonance, which is another psychological phenomenon that suggests that once we sort of commit to the suspect that we chose, we tend to then become more and more confident over time that that is the actual suspect who committed the offense. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this lecture for now, and then in the next lecture we'll talk about some of the things that we can do to improve the accuracy of eyewitness identification.